Elections FAQ, a live discussion where our reporters answer your questions about the 2024 election. I'm Isabel Lohman, the education reporter at Bridge, Michigan. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan news outlet, and we're here to talk about job statistics, crime, and Tuesday's debate. You asked several questions for us, and we've got reporters Jordan Hermany, Simon Schuster, and Mike Wilkinson here to answer your questions. If you have another question, you can drop them in the chat. We'll try our best to answer them. We also have a website, bridgemi.com, which has our previous episodes as well as many questions that we've answered about the election already. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you never miss a show. And today, these events are possible because of the support of Bridge Michigan members. If you'd like to join our membership community, we will drop a link in the chat so you can do so. We're so excited to have all these panelists here today. Last night, there was a debate between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, the two vice presidential candidates in the 2024 election. What was the most memorable moment of the night?
Yeah, I can start. For me, it wasn't necessarily one moment so much as the entire tone of the debate, which was something we hadn't seen in a while. And it was an air of civility, frankly. I mean, you had a couple times where, the vice presidential candidates would turn to one another and say, I'm sure you agree with this too. We're just, two guys who have what's best in mind for our communities at heart here. And all we want to see is this nation succeed. Obviously, they have two different ways of going about that from a policy angle, but it was finally refreshing to kind of see politicians who were able to meet in this debate marketplace of ideas and spar with one another without making it seem ugly, which for a lot of voters I've talked to throughout the cycle, that civility people feel is certainly lacking. We've seen it, that Kamala Harris try to bring that to attention of trying to shift rhetoric away from being so vitriolic. And we really saw that take place last night.
Yeah, I think. Okay, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I sitting here watching it, I was really struck by the fact that here you have two Great Lakes states politicians, one from Minnesota, one from Ohio. And I live in Northwest Ohio, just a couple miles south of the Michigan border. I've seen Vance debate before. He, in the U.S. Senate campaign in 2022, he was way more aggressive. But here he was able to show a little bit of a different side of himself, which I think was probably goal number one, to kind of break away from the caricature that I think the Democrats have tried to portray him, perhaps rightly so. But he presented himself as just another guy from Ohio with some views that a lot of people, I'm sure, in Michigan disagree with.
Yeah, I think that this was definitely agreeing with you both that this was a hugely strategic move on J.D. Vance's part, one that really worked to his benefit. I mean, these two candidates present one another so differently. And you've seen J.D. Vance, he's conducted close to 50 on-camera interviews, many of which have been, frankly, adversarial. And he's, had a lot of practice defending himself. And on the other hand, Tim Walz has done very few media appearances. And so I think that, in a way, by sort of turning on that Midwestern charm on J.D. Vance's part, it sort of disarmed Tim Walz. And he didn't really know how to counter that because, that is so much of his image, right, is this sort of Midwestern humility. And so I think that it really played in J.D. Vance's favor in that regards, especially given that his unfavorability rating is so high right now.
Yeah, and Walz, I thought, he's got that whole, Midwest dad vibe going. And, there were a couple of times where he just didn't get a chance to lean into it. And I thought Vance, as the, Ivy League trained lawyer, kind of got the better of him rhetorically. And Walz, who didn't have the quick retort, about going and getting a beer or fixing your car, was kind of stuck. But it was really enlightening on a number of different levels. And like you said, Jordan, it was just so refreshing that there were, I don't know how many times I said, I agree with you, or I find some of what you said agreeable, when we know very much that, they disagree on really big issues.
Well, and I know, too, that just sitting on the couch watching it with my husband last night, at one point he turned to me kind of jokingly and was like, this is really boring. And I kind of had to laugh because it's like, this is how it's supposed to be, frankly. And I don't mean boring as in, we shouldn't care about these things, but it's a return to form. And for a lot of us whose first presidential election was the 2016 election, it does feel rather foreign.
Yeah, it definitely did.
Absolutely. I mean, you had both candidates talking about the structure of the government, saying that's not what the vice president does. That's up to Congress. That's not really something we generally see. One of our readers asked which candidate directly answered the most questions.
I think that's a little harder to quantify. Frankly, there was a lot, and I actually want to back up for a second. For both of these men, for some people, this was absolutely the first time that they've ever heard either one of them speak, and both of them were very aware of that. You saw, I think it was the very first question that JD Vance got. He actually said, I'll get to that in a moment, but let me back up and introduce myself. And then Tim Walz did the same thing later on in the debate. So, you had both of these men trying to vie to get their personality across, get who they were across, get how they complement their running mate across. And so when it came to answering actual questions, I know that there were some moments where JD Vance did say, and then let me answer your question with just a couple seconds left. But by and large, it was a typical debate in that there were quasi answers, but not full answers, really.
Yeah, I mean, these two candidates, they go in with a lot of prep, and they've got certain lines that they want to make sure that they get out before they hit time. And they don't know, these questions ahead of time, and they don't know whether they're going to have a chance to sort of hit this poll-tested, message-tested line that's really going to send home what their candidacy is about to voters watching at home. But I think, on two of the biggest questions, two of perhaps some of these sore points for each of these candidates, we had some big dodges from them. I think one of the points is when Tim Walz refused to answer if he supports any restrictions on abortion. This notion, generally false, of 9-month elective abortions, and then former President Trump falsely says, abortions after birth, essentially committing murder, is something that Democrats want. The inability to sort of provide a delicate answer on that, it allows them to stick them on that issue. And then the other one, which was the biggest moment for me last night, was the final question in the closing at the 90-minute mark, asking about whether JD Vance would attempt to overturn the results of the election, or whether he believed in particular that the 2020 election, that Trump lost that election. As Tim Walz noted, he is Donald Trump's running mate in part because he hasn't really gone and thrown his upper card candidate under the bus on this issue. And this is huge for the Harris campaign, because when you look at the final weeks, the closing arguments that we're going to have in this presidential election, they're going to stick to economic issues, the Trump side anyway, on economic issues, talking about inflation, cost of living, and then try to paint a rosy picture of their administration. And then I think that you're going to see that the Harris campaign move away from specific policy initiatives, things that they want to do, and talk about democratic institutions, the preservation of democracy, and cast Donald Trump as a threat to that.
And to that point, Simon, you just mentioned the economy. The economy continues to be a topic that our voters are telling us they're concerned about. You and Jordan and Mike talk to voters every single day. We learn a lot about what they care about. Both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump say that large amounts of jobs were created during their administrations, but both seem to be underplaying the part of the pandemic. What do the numbers actually say?
Well, I mean, during the Trump administration, there was, from the beginning of Trump's first, when he was inaugurated in 2017, to the peak of his employment in Michigan. We're talking about Michigan alone. The state added roughly a million jobs. 80. I'm sorry, it added 83,000 jobs. I apologize about that. But then we had the pandemic, and the state lost 1 million jobs in just a couple of months. And we've gained back that many and a few more. It's not 700,000. We are about 50,000. In Michigan, if you compare the beginning of the Biden administration, or the current position where we are in July, to before the pandemic, it's added 50,000. It's a gain, right? And it is a substantial recovery of most of the jobs lost. We're at the largest employment workforce since 2001. So we've seen a lot of gains, but a lot of those gains were also seen during the Trump administration. And you can see both sides trying to say the same thing, blaming COVID for Joe Biden's losses or Trump's losses, and the gains both ways. So it's a mixed bag. We are better off than we were even before the pandemic, but it's not a lot. It's not 700,000.
Thanks for that. And Donald Trump often talks about crime on the campaign trail as well. Mike, you poured over the most recent FBI data. What did you find?
Well, not just the FBI data. I mean, one of the things that's really been confounding people is they both candidates are saying something about crime. One, Trump is saying that crime is up 43% in the United States. And Harris says, most recently when the data came out last week, that violent crime is down in the country. actually, they're both correct, but they use different measures. So in Trump's case, he's using something called a survey that is done by the Department of Justice. And rather than just count how many robberies or how many homicides they are, they actually ask people, have you been a victim of a crime? And that measure has jumped up 43%. Now, there's problems with that survey. It's only 150,000 households nationwide. Whereas when we're looking at actual crime reports, we're looking at almost 95, 98% of the police agencies in the nation. And those are showing that year over year, there is a decline in murders. They did, however, go up in a number of cities in Michigan. There's that cannot be denied. You look at Grand Rapids, it rose substantially in the pandemic, and it has, even though it's gone down, it's slowly going down. It is up in suburbs like Farmington Hills. It is up in places in Flint and others, but it's not. But in many of the places where it is up, the overall rate is not that high. So you have in Detroit, you have 200 crimes per 10,000 people, violent crimes. That's a lot. If you look at Farmington Hills, it's 17. So even though it's up a lot in Farmington Hills, the actual rate and the actual likelihood that you'll be a victim of a crime is relatively small. So these numbers give whatever position you want to take, give you an opportunity to say it. We talked to an expert who said most people will hear these numbers, and what's their personal experience? You've had your car broken into, you're going to think crime is high. You don't know anybody who's a victim of crime, you're going to believe the comment that crime is down. So what is interesting is it seems that the Republican candidate, Trump, is saying less and less about crime, mostly pointing towards immigration. But, whenever they talk about it, they're not wrong. They just are using different data.
Well, and that's why Bridge exists, right? To contextualize the data, to fact check what's happening. On our website right now, we actually have a piece that fact checks what Walz and Vance said last night. So we're going to continue to fact check campaigns and candidates as they're on the trail. Donald Trump is actually expected to be in Michigan on Thursday. Kamala Harris is expected to be here on Friday. What questions do they still have to answer to voters?
Yeah, so I most recently talked to voters throughout some of the 3rd congressional district. And what a lot of voters have uncertainty in their minds right now. Generally, absentee ballots have been out now for almost a week. We're at 6 days since they became eligible for voters. And so we're well into voting season. And I think the cases have largely been made. And this is really about turning out voters at this point. The questions that are the sentiments that were expressed to me by some of the voters that I spoke with is they're exhausted. They're worn out by this incessant campaign. They've been, they're facing a deluge of political ads every time they turn on the television or open their mailbox or even scroll on social media at this point. And so what they're looking at is how the country is going to come together after this election. They're sort of distraught by some of the rampant political division, even as they may hold very strident views themselves. They want to see about how this this country is going to be brought together after the election, regardless of outcome, and then what's going to happen after the election. I talked to voters who are really concerned about uproar that's going to happen after the election, no matter the outcome, and whether there might be outbreaks of violence. These are the sort of things that provide people with a lot of anxiety. Some of what we saw in the fallout from the 2020 election is pretty at the front of people's minds right now, and I think that a lot of folks are hoping that this is sort of just a relatively quiet election, no matter which way it goes, and that they don't have to deal with those sorts of risks.
Frankly, I think we're all hoping for a relatively quiet election. But yeah, no, to Simon's point, he's right on the money. And I guess I would go on just to say that obviously, as with any voters, there's no monolith in Michigan. Michigan voters don't just want one thing. Because to that point, as Simon spent time in the 3rd, last week I spent time in the 10th, which is, parts of Macomb and Oakland County, around the Farmington Hills area, Warren. And down there, there's a lot of concern around trade. There's a lot of economic anxiety surrounding the electrification of America and the role that Michigan plays and our auto manufacturing sector plays in the transition from electric to gas, backwards, from gas to electric, and what that means for jobs in the area. Same difference, was talking to a voter actually this morning, and she was saying that last night during the vice presidential debate, she hadn't realized how much, as an older woman, she's retired in her 70s, but when the vice presidential candidates started talking about childcare, she's, kind of had this light bulb moment where she realized that so much of her own personal life would be impacted by that through, grandchildren or her adult daughters being able to afford some level of childcare, different levels of childcare depending on your economic status. So, voters are hanging out here for a lot of different things. And I'm at the point now, frankly, where there's so many voters I've talked to who have made up their minds. They have made up their minds, and we are really talking about these margin voters who are very specific, either issues or they frankly just don't know what they want. I don't know how else to phrase that, where, they just need to hear more from these candidates. They need to figure out who Kamala Harris is, who Tim Walz is. Obviously, we've seen Donald Trump out on the scene for quite some time now. But, as for what these candidates could say this week that could swing voters, I guess that remains to be seen.
For sure. There's about a month left, but as Simon already noted, early voting has started. And then I just want to end on this because we talk a lot about the presidential campaigns because obviously that's what gets people out into the ballot boxes in the first place. But let's end on this. Simon, Jordan, and Mike, what is one thing you're looking for in this election that isn't related to the presidential candidates? So it can be something down ballot. It could be something you've heard from voters. What's one thing? Simon?
I would have to say control of the Michigan House right now. Democrats have just a 56 to 54 majority in the state legislature. They won the majority in the last election, gaining control of that and trifecta control of the government for the first time in nearly 40 years. And now if Republicans are able to hold on to the seats that they have now and flip just one or two seats, we could see a markedly changed state government that's going to have to completely alter the way it does business over the next 2 years. So watching some of these really tight races where millions of dollars, frankly, are being spent, and we have an unprecedented amount of spending that's going into these elections, is going to be really interesting, particularly because some of these people activated voters look at some of these elections separate from the presidential race. There are folks that, are disgusted by former President Donald Trump, sort of more your old guard Republicans, more traditional conservatives who can never see themselves voting for him. They might even vote for Kamala Harris. But when you get down the ballot, they're open to Republicans who are going to be avoiding some of the presidential fracas and some of the more vitriolic rhetoric that we're seeing at the top of the ticket. So I'm going to be really watching that closely and really interested to see how that turns out.
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Mike.
Oh, I'm curious about Congress and how many people are actually going to not switch their votes, but vote for one party for the top and a different party for Congress. We have Senator candidate Slotkin, who is running as a Democrat for the U.S. Senate, replacing Debbie Stabenow. You've got Mike Rogers, who's aligned himself with Trump. Are the coattails going to extend? We have a couple of congressmen, and I think we're 7-6 split right now, Democrat in the state. Help me here, political reporters. There are some people who are exposed. The Slotkin seat has no longer got an incumbent in it. In Ohio, we're seeing something really strange in Ohio. Trump has won the state twice by huge margins, but the sitting U.S. senator who has a very well-funded opponent still might win. So you're going to see people who will split their ticket. That's the word I was looking for, who will split their ticket. I'm curious to see how much that happens.
Yeah, and in the same vein as Simon, Michigan House is up for debate. So is the state Supreme Court, and that's another kind of sleeper, I would say, race that we obviously have a number of reasons why the Supreme Court is important. Just even in recent memory, I mean, we're right now undergoing a potential shift if the legislature doesn't intervene into a brand new minimum wage. We could see the end of the tipped wage by the end of this decade. It was also the same Supreme Court that codified abortion access into the Michigan Constitution. And there are 2 Democrats right now who are running for it, 2 Republicans right now who are running for a seat. And who has court control right now? Democrats do, alongside that legislative trifecta, which obviously works to the Democratic Party's favor in Michigan. Should they lose that, they will be faced with a less friendly state court, or the tip of the court system in Michigan when it comes to the state law. They could lose that, and that could be something that could also have a dramatic impact on the types of policies that Democrats would like to achieve should they, again, retain the trifecta that they currently have.
Gotcha. So a lot of things to consider: the state house, Congress, the state Supreme Court, and of course, every other race that's on the ballot. And we're going to keep keeping track of all of these things. Our website has all of these different things on bridgemi.com. If you want more election updates, you can go to our website. You can also get our free Politics Watch newsletter. Like I just mentioned, we have that elections tracker and we have a nonpartisan voter guide. We also have these videos, which we'll continue to do through the election every Monday at 11:30. This was a special edition. We'd love for you to hit that subscribe button on YouTube as well. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back next week.